call us to order. Thank you all for coming. I'm excited to welcome you all to a conversation about great power diplomacy by Wess Mitchell, our guest today. Covers everything from Attila the Hun to Henry Kissinger. And a while ago, when we were planning this, Professor Fever and I came up with a lot of fun Attila the Hun jokes. I tried to trap you into who in the first Trump administration that you served was most like Attila the Hun. Who would Attila the Hun have liked? But we'll leave that off for now because you're all here to hear from Wess Mitchell, but I would be remiss and also would get in trouble if I didn't use this captive audience moment to tell you about some other events that are coming up. On the 13th of November, Salam Fayyad, former Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. It will surprise none that tickets are required for that event. For members of the Duke community, they're available on Duke groups. You can register. I think they're available as we speak, and so you can get your ticket for that. On the 20th of November, we'll host former director of the CIA, former deputy secretary of state, Bill Burns. That is also ticketed via this time Duke box office, just to keep everyone on their toes. So the Bill Burns event also open, also tickets required on the 20th. And then finally, I think the last event of the year, on the 1st of December, former Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is coming to Duke. Page Auditorium, tickets also required via Duke box office. So a lot to look forward to for everyone going forward, but you're not here to hear about that. Just do that. Mad at me. You're here to hear from Dr. Wess Mitchell, principal and co-founder of the Marathon Initiative, former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs in the first Trump administration, overseeing U.S. foreign policy to that entire swath of geography and some really pivotal and important and interesting. Looking forward to talking to a little bit about, and for our purposes today, the author of the book that I see on many desks and in many hands, Great Power Diplomacy. Attila the Hun. Thanks for coming. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, son.
So let's start with this. Why this book now? It seems to me, tell me if you disagree, it seems to me that diplomacy kind of gets a bad rap. It's weak, ineffectual, legalistic, begging to be suckered. So why this book now? Why write a history of great power diplomacy?
Well, it's a great question. And before I answer it, let me say what a privilege it is to be here. And thank you. I'm flattered that so many people turned out to hear about the book, which was a real delight to write, and it allowed me to work on some topics that are dear to my heart. But I just want to say at the top, I want to commend Simon and Peter, others on your faculty for keeping a focus on grand strategy as a discipline and a topic and a frame of mind, because I think for reasons that we'll probably discuss, along with diplomacy and diplomatic history, I think grand strategy is something of maybe not a lost art, but it's a minority subject these days in curricula on college campuses. And this is a good segue into answering your question. I think what let's see. Well, I think
it is still like 6:30.
I wrote the book because I think we're entering an era when grand strategy, in the full and traditional sense of that, as a discipline and as a practice of high statecraft, is necessary again for the United States. Much more necessary, I would argue, for national survival and the well-being and security of our country than it was at any point in the previous generation and for quite some time. So when I came out of the first Trump administration, I did not set out to write a book about diplomacy. As I was saying to a group of your study students earlier, the problem I was really seized with from a grand strategic perspective and my time in government really impressed this upon me, just the events, the world events at that time, is what people in the Pentagon call the simultaneity problem. And this is what I think is certainly from my view, the most profound national security problem facing the United States today. And it's simply stated, it's the problem that arises from the fact that we no longer maintain a military that's postured or equipped to handle all of our conceivable enemies simultaneously. So if you go back to the 90s or the early 2000s, the United States maintained a 2 or 2.5 war standard military, meaning we were set up militarily with the assumption that we could deter or, if necessary, fight and win conflicts against China and Russia simultaneously, so 2 big wars, and maybe a 0.5 smaller war at the same time. So that's no longer the case, and it's no longer been the case for quite some time. The last 2 national defense strategies made it clear that the United States sees China as the pacing challenge, pacing threat, and that our military is set up for 1 big war. So if that's the problem that we face, what do we do about the wide gap between the national means that are at our disposal in the form of military and economic power and the ends to which those means could be applied? That is a classic formulation of a problem for grand strategy. So to write the book, I started out by asking this question, and in the course of looking into that question, it took me more and more towards diplomacy as a tool of strategy that great powers across the ages have used precisely for that problem, for managing space and time. When you face too many enemies or too powerful a set of enemies to defeat by military means alone, and you don't want to enter into, or maybe you can't enter into, an exhausting, prolonged military buildup that would sap your economy. So that was the problem set. And in the course of researching that problem in strategy, I came to focus less and less on how you posture your armies or how you're moving units around on the game board, and more to how are you using your diplomacy to make sure you have enough allies and to make sure that at least some portion of your adversaries at any given moment are not in the hostile column. So it's kind of the starting point was a strategy question.
So you've hit on a really interesting theme that runs through the book, which is sort of the utility of diplomacy to offset weakness. Right? If you are Theodosius II, the first case study, if we can call them that in the book, is about Byzantium and the Huns, the Horde. You tell a really interesting story about how the Byzantines are sort of totally aware that they cannot go to war with the Huns. The Huns have innovated this technology in archery, compound bows, console bows, that there's no way that they can manage. And so it's fascinating to me how the story you tell in so many of these case studies, whether it's Theodosius II dealing with Attila, or Chamberlain dealing with Hitler, which is the case study that's kind of on my mind because I lectured about this earlier this afternoon. There are some survivors of that class still in this room today, inexplicably. This notion that diplomacy is meant to address weaknesses, deficits, things like that, is that fair characterization of how you see the real essential value of this tool and the sort of grand strategic tool?
Yes, I think that is the prompt that invariably brings diplomacy to the fore as an instrument of strategic statecraft. And one thing that became clear to me looking at history is states, or let's just say groups of leaders, because that's really what my book is about. It's different vignettes of groups of leaders who are grappling with the multi-front problem. The first recourse of a state is almost never to diplomacy. States are going to reach for the instrument that is most likely to quickly and efficiently ensure their survival. And that's always, historically, in every example I looked at, it's the military tool. And that military itch is natural. It runs very deep in every culture, and it makes sense.
So now, why is the military tool I would think kind of the money tool, right? The sort of the quick response.
Well, so looking at, say, antiquity, that's a good starting point. I think the good illustration of this principle can be found in Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War, where early on in the book, the Spartans are debating whether or not to go to war with Athens. And Sthenelaitis, a senior member of the Spartan political elite, makes this impassioned case for war. And what is he appealing to? Well, part of what he's appealing to is the gratification that comes from the sword. Reach for this military instrument. We're gonna, the idea that the war will be over for Christmas is a very old idea. It predates Christmas. It'll be quick. We'll show them who's boss. We're the guys who beat the Persians. Who are these Athenians? They're sea people, whatever. But there's something else implicit in his declamation, and it's honor. It's this idea that there's something intrinsically honorable about the use of military force, and to a certain extent, he's right. But by extension, there's something that is dishonorable about diplomacy, and this is a very old sort of pallor that's hung over diplomacy from the very beginning. Excuse my language, but Napoleon's line about Talleyrand that he was shit in silk stockings is a very old idea. It's that, okay, if you think of the military solution to, say, the Huns, the same counsel was being heard in the chambers of Byzantine state with Theodosius II, and he has these Gothic generals who served his father very ably, and they're talking about the Huns, and it's like, we're the best military around. Let's handle them. And who is it that comes forward and counsels diplomacy? Well, it's not the most shining exemplar of virtue. It's Chrysafius, a court eunuch. And so all the way back to the very earliest days of diplomacy, there is something almost, diplomacy almost has an occult art sense about it, that you're hazarding the most important thing imaginable, which is the security of the state, on something that's shadowy. It's going to be behind closed doors. The fact that you're even willing to compromise with the enemy makes the diplomat suspect in the history of grand strategy. And maybe this is part of why in the modern era, if you think about grand strategy, at least in the American mind, certainly in the United States since the end of the Cold War, when you think grand strategy, you think of a map with armies moving around. It's inherently a military notion. And I think in the modern era, that's being reinforced by the technologies that we have at our disposal, which promise the ultimate substitute to diplomacy, in that when you think of precision guided munitions, that you can hit a button and you can watch the televised results, and you can do it by remote control. So in the period since the end of the Cold War, American power was so vast in comparison to any conceivable rival that I think on the military side, the Sthenelaitis side of the critique of diplomacy, it's really been on steroids. It's almost to the point that grand strategy has become, I think it's Hugh Strachan has written about, this is a British academic, has written about strategy in the modern world has become about the study of operations.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So this one's, and so, but I have to mention that there is a countervailing impulse that the book is also implicitly arguing against. And it's not an altogether modern tendency, but I think it's very pronounced now. And it's the idea that international law will remove the sources of conflict from, it will create rules and multilateral bodies above the level of the nation state. It's Immanuel Kant's dream. It goes all the way back to the time of the Greeks as well. But I frame the book in this way, that you can think of the two critiques of diplomacy as being the critique of the soldier, which I've just articulated, and the critique of the jurist or the lawyer, or really originally the priest, which is that diplomacy is inherently immoral, and that there's a cleaner way. Both are talking about a substitute to diplomacy. For the soldier, the substitute to diplomacy is clear; it's military force. To the lawyer, the substitute to diplomacy is cleaner. It's more ethical. It's these bodies where rational people will meet, and they'll remove the sources of conflict. So the book is really a thread that runs through it is in debates about strategy, juxtaposing diplomacy to the other options that were available. But it's almost never the first recourse.
So in the American context, it seems to me that a lot of the early American leaders really recoiled against what we would call diplomacy. And they assigned it sort of the ultimate epithet of the time, which is that it was European. That it was, this was what the old system from which they were trying to break, both, obviously legally in terms of rebellion, but also sort of spiritually as founding a republic, that diplomacy starts out on the back foot, so to speak, in the American context. So what is the sort of specific, if there is one, American diplomatic tradition, as you see it, that is born from this very acute discomfort? But obviously, and the last of your case studies is the United States in the Cold War, comes to be an important, if sometimes belittled, sort of tool in the American strategic tool.
I think that the short answer, that if I had to just condense it to a line or a tag that applies throughout, from the early American Republic onward, it's this notion of the United States as a great commercial maritime republic, whose greatest advertisement is the virtue of its citizenry, who is maintaining, ultimately what it came down to was we were acting as the holder of the scales of the balance of power in the old world. But in a way, we didn't entirely want to get our hands dirty. We were convinced of our own virtues as a nation that was founded in very high ideals. I think certainly for the revolutionary generation, you're right. Diplomacy was a pejorative thing. It was associated with war making and with the machinations of courts in Europe.
And the Genet affair,
Right.
all that sort of.
They're jockeying over pieces of territory and doing backroom deals while we were like the virtuous sort of homespun. I mean, in the early American Republic, we didn't even allow diplomatic titles. Our diplomatic corps had to eschew entirely the traditional trappings and powers plenipotentiary, ambassador, all these titles. And in a period when European diplomats, they wore uniforms. I mean, there was a very elaborate etiquette. And so from the beginning, we had a complicated relationship with diplomacy. It quickly became apparent that we needed diplomacy of a very pragmatic kind. We needed to be able to conduct what you would nowadays call realism. I mean, it was, I think the style of diplomacy that developed in the American Republic had a big dose of a kind of homegrown version of realism that was sort of a combination of the British maritime commercial mindset, a little bit of an aversion to standing alliances, this kind of thing, but with a big dose of something that was uniquely American, but was our own sort of hardscrabble form of making do and following necessity, but often doing it in the name of virtue. And I think that's been a recurrent theme in our history. But we showed ourselves quickly capable of the most strategic forms of diplomacy with the best of them. And from a very early point, we practiced diplomacy very effectively. But along the way, and certainly by the time of Woodrow Wilson in the 20th century, old world diplomacy had once again become synonymous with a kind of sinister, venal practice. And so, of course, Woodrow Wilson, after World War I, puts forward this vision of the world that's also tied up with the American story in diplomacy, but it embraces the legalistic substitute to diplomacy and posits this international set of organizations above the level of the nation state that will adjudicate matters in the way that democracies do internally. But you shouldn't mistake this. You shouldn't mistake Wilson's vision for the essence of kind of what the American approach to diplomacy was. It was, his vision was quixotic, slightly messianic, never anything that could be implemented. But it doesn't mean that Americans historically have been bad at traditional diplomacy.
I'm going to confound my students' expectations and not take your bait and launch into, at this point, Professor Miles's trademarked "I hate Woodrow Wilson" rant.
Steal my thunder.
which many people here have been subjected to, maybe later. But I want to pull back a little bit and ask, as you're doing this work, you're trained in history, but you've also served in government. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the experience of working through these historical problems, having worked through perhaps similar, perhaps wildly dissimilar, and certainly very different contextually. I don't believe that under either Tillerson or Pompeo there was a court unit in the state.
Not that I'm aware of.
Not officially. How did that shape your? This is a very scholarly work written by someone with real practitioner experience. How did the latter shape the former as you approach the challenge?
Well, I'm a history buff at heart, so a lot of what you see in the book is just my interest in explaining to myself through history, through the use of history. Theory is boring. I think we can all agree, and so I avoid theory entirely in the book.
Absolutely, also a waste of time.
But one thing that became clear to me when I went into government is that the truth of what Kissinger said, that when you're in government, you're consuming intellectual capital that you grew or cultivated when you were not in government. And I think that's fundamentally true. That by the time you're in a policymaking role, you don't have time to reflect on these kind of 1,000-year perspectives. And I mean, in government, the long term is like a month or 6 weeks, and you're reacting to events and you're always on the go. So the higher conceptual stuff is not a luxury that you have in a policymaking role. You're busy, you're tired. There's a lot of physical fatigue, mental fatigue, the politics of it, as well as the policy. But the other thing that became clear to me, and it's connected to that, is that one thing that government does not do well is strategy. It's part of why I think it's so important that there be programs like the one here at Duke that focus on grand strategy. Government is, as I've just said, a short-term. It's a set of entities that are focused on the short term. And even those parts of government that are nominally tasked with strategy typically aren't doing it or aren't doing it well. I mean, the policy planning staff at the State Department hasn't done high strategies since Kennan and NHTSA. These days, it's like a glorified speech writer for the secretary. No offense to people at the policy planning staff, but it certainly isn't constructing strategy. Pentagon Office of Net Assessment, they're doing long range thinking, but they're not constructing strategy in the sense of conceptualizing the higher, kind of ends of state, the opportunities and threats of the outside world, and the means at our disposal in economic, military, and diplomatic form. It's just not happening. So I think when a person is outside of government, whether they do or don't eventually serve in government, that's the time, if you're interested in these things, to reflect on history and strategy. In writing the book, I thought a lot about what I had seen at State Department. And one way that's influences the book is how much attention I pay in all the chapters to bureaucracy. And what a particular group of leaders, whatever they were trying to accomplish in the world, how they related to the people of their bureaucracy, how they used the machine, and in some cases had to transcend or work around the machinery of state to actually conduct strategy. Because I found that bureaucracy militates against coherence in policy at all to begin with, but it certainly militates against higher level coordination of the strategies, the implementation of strategy. So say you have the national security strategy and it sets out a broad path for the country in what you might call our grand strategy. Your ability to reflect on the various pieces of government and how they support that role will be stronger if, when you're not in government, you've kind of stood back and looked at it and conceptualized these things. But bureaucracy is a major theme throughout the book. And one takeaway that was interesting to me is how frequently you see groups of leaders who are frustrated with their bureaucracy and are either attempting to completely reform it in the way that the Trump administration right now is criticized, say, for trying to reform the State Department, or completely working around it in the way that Kissinger did, and the way that Bismarck did. And there are many notable examples in my book of leaders looking at bureaucracy and basically saying, okay, this is a set of institutions and people that I'm going to either have to completely rewire it or work around it in order to achieve the chief things that I'm trying to, the strategy. And that was very striking to me.
So this is interesting because like if the avatar of bureaucracy were in the room with us today, the avatar of bureaucracy say the reason that you have them is to do everything that you, Wess Mitchell, just said I can't do. I am the consistency. I am the longer range sort of vision, especially in a system like the US system, where there is so much partisan turnover based on the occupant of the White House, right? Which is something that I think a lot of folks don't fully appreciate, the extent to which so many more jobs change over in the United States based on party in power, in executive power, vice in your sort of your UK, so Canada, so, even France, Germany. Germany, it's illegal to have non-career ambassadors. So there's no format. So how would you answer bureaucracy's self-defense and say, I am how we get long-range thinking because I am.
It's not altogether wrong. The bureaucracy emerges in the story of diplomacy as a competitive tool. So go back to the Byzantines, the Bureau of Barbarians. They decide that they need a bureaucracy in order to do certain things that enhance the state's ability to compete geopolitically. One of them is know a lot about the tribes around your borders. What are their languages? What are their customs? Who are their enemies? How can we use that fact to our advantage? Understand their languages. Second, a repository of information on treaties. If we've had a treaty with tribe X on our frontier, it might be good for our diplomats to know that in 20 years when they're negotiating over a boundary dispute. So from an early point, there's a recognition that diplomacy, much like with the military or any other function of state, does need a dedicated class of professionals who understand that subject matter and retain this as a form of strategic knowledge for the state. And in the book, I argue this in a very straightforward way that, make no mistake, we need professional diplomats. There is a role for bureaucracy and diplomacy. The problem is inherent to bureaucracies. And so organization theory, right? The minute you create an institution, it develops its own, so mission creep sets in very quickly. The quest for resources for any large bureaucracy is more important than any other objective. And so, I found at State Department that often the individual bureaus of the State Department are far more interested in doing battle with one another than they are with advancing a particular national, slight overstatement, but it's like, as long as we're beating, the East Asia Bureau, it doesn't really matter what happens with Russia as long as that mentality, right, is present in bureaucracy. But bureaucracies exist, they reach a point in their life cycle where they exist to bring in more resources for themselves as an end in itself. And therein lies the problem. And so what you see in the history of geopolitics, and it's true in diplomacy, it's probably also true in war, is that the bureaucracies that experience mission creep and take a life of their own, groups of leaders who are, in a way, the way I picture it is they're reading the tea leaves of the international environment. They're looking at where the crisis and the danger is at. There come moments where the bureaucracy has to be brought back into line with the imperatives of the state. The bureaucracy is going to go off and do its own thing. And I think that's especially pronounced in long, peaceful, fat periods of history, like we just lived through over the last 30 years, where our institutions, I would argue, took a life of their own, seized onto all kinds of goals and objectives, a large number of which are at best secondary to the interests of the state. Not a lot of discipline in those institutions over the last 30 years because we were living in a pretty permissive, resource-rich environment as a country. I think what happens as international events move more towards danger and crisis is that states pull wayward bureaucracies back to that laser focus. In the case of diplomacy, the reason you have bureaucracy for diplomacy, again, the particularist knowledge of foreign places, which we've lost a lot of in recent years, in my opinion, the deep particular knowledge of local languages, customs, et cetera. The ability to negotiate, which goes back to the very beginning of bureaucracy and diplomacy. Negotiation is a human skill that can be taught and learned through experience. So, bringing our institutions nowadays in American diplomacy back to those original purposes in light of the needs and interests of the state, I think is a very worthwhile undertaking for our leaders. It's hard to get it right. It takes time, and it's political, and it's messy. But in my view, from my time at the State Department, the reform of the place is absolutely necessary.
What else would you say are these sort of the key competencies, key capabilities for doing effective diplomacy? Because your case studies are covering everything from Venice to Austria-Hungary, Metternich, Bismarck. These are very different states with very different, blessed with very different quantities of resources and varieties of resources, et cetera. But as you, not only as you sort of experienced, but also as you learned when you put together this book, I mean, what does that really effective, successful diplomatic toolkit look like? The other way to phrase the question I'm asking is, what should all these students aspire to be when they leave our doors in terms of what they can do?
Well, if you go back to the early days of the U.S. State Department, look at the competencies that it originally was entrusted with. It's pretty impressive. And then look over time at how they've been stripped away. So think of commerce. Originally, that was a competency of the State Department. You could make a list, actually. The USTR, competencies that over time have migrated away from State Department. And so now in the 21st century, you look at the State Department, and you say, okay, if you're the Secretary of State and you're in a cabinet meeting and you're sitting there next to the Secretary of Defense, and we know what he has at his back, right? So not just a powerful bureaucracy, but military force. What does the Secretary of State really have in those discussions? What is his WASTA or his weight in decision-making councils consist of? He's got embassies. It's not nothing. I mean, we don't communicate everything in the old-fashioned way through an ambassador, but the embassy is a really vital resource for U.S. national security. It's keeping its finger on the pulse of local goings-on and rhythms in that country in a way that espionage doesn't do in quite the same way. Okay, so that's not nothing. I would argue, ultimately, what the Secretary of State should have at his or her back, if we're talking in terms of institutions and bureaucracy, is an institution in the form of the State Department that really knows its stuff about the varied places in the world that we operate, our adversaries in particular, but also our allies. So again, particularist knowledge. Second, people who know how to negotiate, who can get in the room on matters of life and death and war and peace. And it's not just like something that they're moonlighting in or they're good at it because of personality. That we have a core of trained negotiators who are good at what they do. And third, I think, and I saw this over and over and again in the bureaucracies I looked at in the book, there has to be a conceptualization ability in a diplomatic bureaucracy. So in other words, you don't just need Holbrooks who are negotiating these things. You need Kennans who are conceptualizing how the practice of your diplomacy links up with the higher ends of strategy, in our case, in the form of the national security strategy, et cetera, et cetera. So you need those pieces. I think those are the three that stand out most to me and were recurrent across the chapters in the book. I mean, I would say for students who are thinking about a career in national service, good for you. If you gravitate towards diplomacy, I would keep those three things in mind. I mean, ask yourself at the end of the day, from a no-nonsense U.S. national security perspective, why do we have diplomats? Why do we have a State Department? There's a big swath of the stuff that the State Department does right now that is not necessary. Not all of it. There's a lot of fine people at the State Department. But I would argue there's a lot of stuff that the State Department has gotten into over the last 30 years that as we get deeper into great power competition, a lot of that will fall to the wayside as either unnecessary or deleterious to the practice of diplomacy. So go into it for the right reasons. Hopefully that's out of patriotism and not social activism. I saw a lot of that at the State Department, just to put that out there. I think there's a lot of it in the federal workforce. It's a byproduct of the era of history that we've come through. Bear in mind that you exist as a public servant to serve the U.S. public interest, the national interest, and that is not a partisan thing. And keep that in mind, that it is something above the level of day-to-day politics, and it should be imbued with a higher sense of purpose. I think that too is something that we lost along the way. So I think the motivations matter. And then finally, whatever it is that you've decided to do with your career, and let's say you end up in State Department or somewhere in government, you're really good at it. Like, take pride in it. The nature of bureaucracy militates against excellence in your profession at times. And so be prepared for that. Inoculate yourself against it. Remember why you're in that line of work, why it makes a difference, and take it really damn seriously and be good at it. And that's not only good advice in a hyper partisan age, I think it's good advice in an era of AI, when almost everything that humans do, including increasingly thinking, can be outsourced. It's really a call for you to have the discipline and focus to get really good at your trade craft, whatever that may be, in a way that, we were saying earlier, you can't outsource creativity. Be good at the core of what you went into your career to do in a way that is not easily replaceable. And whatever it is that your career is, you will do well in that thing. It's my sense.
So you teed me up to shift gears a little bit towards the contemporary before I open it up to questions from the room. So when you structure all of the case studies in the book, you sort of talk through the situation in which each of these countries find themselves, their geography, the threats, the dilemmas, the constraints, the opportunities, their options, and things like that, the mindset, the sort of governmental, bureaucratic resources, etc. If you had to run that analysis not on the serene Republic of Venice, but on the current Republic of the United States, what does that look like to you at this juncture in time?
That's a great question. And a lot of what I see, this is just my opinion, looking at it from the outside, of U.S. behavior today in our foreign policy, defense policy, fits the classic mold of a great power that reaches a point in its history where it faces this multi-front problem and has to fundamentally reassess how it's going about matching the means at its disposal, economy, military power, et cetera, to the ends of the outside environment. And whatever you think about policy on a day-to-day basis that's playing out in various regions or anything else, I think you first have to gain altitude on it. And you could argue this is imposing strategic reason on it. I would argue it's partly that, but that there is an understanding within the state right now about the strategic predicament we're in. You have to start by seeing the problem of simultaneity and then seeing how U.S. policy, when we look at the world, in a way, the U.S. has to, as the leading power in the international system, we have to rearrange things internationally, both with our allies and with our adversaries, in a way that repositions us to compete more effectively. With our allies, when I look at the Trump administration and I see its approach to trade and security, what it's saying to our allies is the bargain that we have operated with you since World War II is no longer solvent. It doesn't work. If we want to preserve the alliances, we have to renegotiate this bargain or compact at the heart of those alliances. That's absolutely necessary in my view. So take Europe. After World War II, the US opened its markets to Europe on a non-reciprocal basis. It made sense at that time to do so because we made up like 50% of global GDP. We also extended a very favorable set of security guarantees to the Europeans. And the basic bargain was, by and large, if you go along with our policy direction, we provide protection. You wake up 80 years later, and it's not only is it not the post-World War II world, it's not the unipolar moment. And there's a rising China, and Russia is serious about expansion, and you've got DPRK and Iran, and we make up whatever, like 12% of global GDP. There has to be a course correction. And the challenge of statecraft in our generation, to my mind, is to take that disruption and to be clear, I think what Trump is doing is absolutely, it's necessary disruption, but to channel that over successive administrations towards constructive outlets that are preservationist to nature. So we want to preserve our alliances. Yes, we want them to bear a bigger burden, and we need reciprocity in trade, or we won't have any industrial ability to compete with China long-term, full stop. So that has to be done. But to channel that disruptive energy towards constructive outlets, I think this administration gets that, but I think a lot of people looking at it from the outside, all they see is the disruption. They don't see a rhyme or a reason. I think there is a rhyme and a reason. I think it's imposed by very dangerous external circumstances, the state of the world strategically from a U.S. perspective. And I think there's something similar right now happening in our diplomacy. As I see towards our adversaries, not just our allies, my view of the Trump administration's opening moves in diplomacy over the last few months has been that it is attempting to bring down the crisis in the secondary theater, Europe, and to the extent possible also in the tertiary theater, the Middle East, in order to have the bandwidth to focus more on the Pacific. I think it's pursuing a diplomatic format with the Chinese that would at least provide a period of stability. We need time to get our act in order internally, industrially, socially. And so when I look at it across the board, I mean, the various pieces, to me, it looks a lot like how great powers historically have repositioned at moments like the one that we're at, where you face a multi-front crisis and you face dangers that are beyond your immediate military ability to bear. So I see the administration as attempting to reformulate, rebalance our commitments in that sense in a way that supports long-term competition.
So those ends make sense. But at least to this observer, it seems that there might be some execution challenges. So at the end of the book, you sort of give some nice distilled lessons from the case studies. And one of them, it's my favorite of your lessons, Wes, the little guys matter. And I can't help but wonder whether what you're describing as renegotiation, rebalancing, especially on trade, feels that way and is understood that way by American partners, whether that's in the Indo-Pacific or in Europe, or for that matter, in North America, right? Tariffs because of cheating on a commercial for actually completely accurately putting on the issue of free trade. And so how do you see the execution of some of this? Because, well, that might be the strategic logic. It seems to me, certainly when I travel around Europe, that is not how it is understood. And that in a world where the Chinese also have their own ambitions about balancing and alliances growing, how worried are you that some of those little guys who matter might start having wandering acts?
Well, it's always a valid concern or consideration for U.S. foreign policy, what you're describing in, I think, in any administration. At moments of change in the international system, I think it's inevitable that smaller powers, and particularly those that are near a frontier, are weighing options between balancing and bandwagon, right? So staying with the leading power, the United States, in a coalition or an alliance, or looking for ways, maybe formally or informally, to hedge their bets and align with, to some extent, or maybe at least not vigorously oppose a rising power. So I think those dynamics are real, and they exist for structural reasons that are becoming more acute the more we're seeing the shifts in the international balance of power accelerate, and the rise of China and intensification of the military rivalry. Some of that's just structural in nature. Now, policy from the U.S. perspective we can reassure allies. Policy can either help or hurt, but the end goal has to be, coming back to the U.S. strategic perspective, our ability to match ends to means in a grand strategic sense. And so alliances are very important. And I've spent most of my life working on the European alliances. I care a great deal about the Atlantic relationship, but it is also true that they are not an end in themselves. Alliances, the fact that we have alliances, the bonhomie of these relationships, or let's say the political cohesion, I think in recent years, too often those came to be mistaken for the point of the thing. So when Biden in his term would go to Europe and criticize the previous administration for abusing allies, I'm sure that, sounded very good to Europeans. But I also think that serious observers in Europe and in Asia among our allies understand the US situation. They understand that we've allowed our industry to atrophy, that our military is not in a position to fight multiple wars. And so I think they get it. I think that they understand that we need, I was in Asia recently, I was in Europe a little bit earlier this year, and you do hear some of the usual noise. But unlike even in the first Trump administration, when I talk to allied officials, I think there's an understanding that we need reciprocity. Just to take one example from the headlines, reciprocity in trade relationships, or something like it, writing of the scales, is necessary to support a degree of U.S. reindustrialization. I think that's fairly well understood. I think it's even understood among some of our allies that are now making big investments in the United States as a result of these trade deals, that's an investment in their own security. Because if the U.S. industrial base if we're incapable of making propellers for aircraft carriers, that doesn't help our allies either. Their security is dependent on us. So I will grant you that the execution is key. I'm not going to defend every jot and tittle of recent policy, but I think the broad direction of the strategy is right. And the final thing is, I'll say, I think the execution is better than maybe you're giving credit for. What we haven't seen are the wilder predictions at the start of, it was true in Trump 1, and now at the beginning of Trump 2, there have been so many predictions that Trump is going to walk away from NATO, or he's going to abandon Poland or Estonia or Taiwan. And those things haven't happened yet. I think they haven't happened because from a US perspective, it's in our interest not to precipitously retrench from those commitments. But clearly there's a need for a rebalancing. So really this administration, and I think future administrations, are going to have to strike that balance between how do you reposition, consolidate, renovate the existing setup that you've built over the last 8 decades, while also reassuring your allies that this is not about looming retrenchment and there's an art form to that, but it's a balance that has to be struck.
And it's a tough one. I'm going to allow myself one last question, and then I'm going to open it up. And if you want to ask more questions, catch my eye, and I'll put you on my mental list. So there are all these there's these great tropes whenever you teach diplomacy, and I'm sure you've encountered all of these. We need a solarium for X, or we need the Kissinger for this problem, the guy who can come up, or the Kennan for this moment, the guy who can come up with the big paradigmatic concept that makes all of this information make sense in one unified way. And one of the things I love about this book, one of the things I love about diplomatic history, is that there are so many great people, great characters, not necessarily people of great character, but great characters who populate these stories. Larger than life, deeply flawed, but fascinating human beings. And so I wonder who does the United States need today to tackle the China problem, to tackle the Russia problem, to tackle the tertiary theater in the Middle East? Of the folks that you've studied, I'm wondering if there's someone who stands out in your mind as having the mindset or the skill set or just the proclivities to really be of great help now.
That's a great
but
question.
They're dead, so
Well, if they're dead, that makes it easier.
yes, yeah. Let's stick to dead folks. Then you're not.
It'd be great.
Then you're not doing anything. Not making any political statements.
Well, I think I would choose a Bismarck over, say, my natural predilection, which would be towards a Metternich. So my previous book was about the Habsburgs, but I say that because for a couple of reasons. One, Metternich and Bismarck were both grappling with a particularly acute version of the geopolitical problem. They were, Germany, and before it, the Austrian Empire, occupied the center space on the game board. And there was a higher math of diplomatic combinations for the Austrians and the Germans that was just almost impossibly difficult. But I would say Bismarck over Metternich, because Metternich was playing a weak game, and he played it very well, probably by diplomatic finesse, extended the great power status of the House of Austria for at least half a century, maybe longer. But the United States is not, we don't have the weak hand that Austria had. We don't necessarily need the concert system that Austria needed in order to stay a great power. But I think Imperial Germany is different because the latent economic and military strength of Germany, but managing these various pieces, and in Germany's case, what impressed me so much about Bismarck is he had a grasp for well, he called it his nightmare, right? His nightmare of encircling coalitions. But he had a grasp for the sharp challenge, the threat that Germany would face if it ever had to fight Russia and France simultaneously. And his diplomacy, for all of its complexity, boiled down to avoiding that scenario. So he really foresaw what Germany was going to face in both world wars. So I think what's needed, and I'm not arguing that this person is alive now or somebody who writes about this stuff, is that level of combining a conceptual understanding of the fundamental problem with sophistication and understanding of the policy piece and the art of the possible. Because the U.S. today, for the reasons we've just discussed, we don't, we're carrying a lot of alliances and sort of fixed assets of foreign policy that have accumulated over the last 80 years in the form of our alliances. I, for one, would argue it's in our interest to preserve them. I like Queen Victoria's line that we should not be in the business of giving up what we hold. I think that's a good starting point. But it's also true that we have to make proactive adjustments in order to preserve it. That the status quo, simply doing things the way that we've done them, won't work. So I think we need that level of sophistication that I associate with a Bismarck. But one thing that I have that gives me some optimism is I think the United States, unlike, say, 10 years ago, I think we're now so much more advanced conceptually along the curve of understanding the predicament that we're in. We have a culture of thinking about grand strategy that has atrophied somewhat since the Cold War, but we do have a culture of grand strategy. And there are very few great powers in history that can say that. I mean, the British had a culture of grand strategy. Maybe it's because they also ran a global empire in a sense. There are other examples that I came across in my book, but that gives me hope in that it's not one person that I think is going to save us. It's kind of like in the Cold War where there was a generational sort of incremental, you had a Kennan, and he understood one critical piece of the puzzle, which was the long-term piece and the nature of Russian power. Probably didn't understand politics and small p power that well, but he conceptualized the problem. You had a
terrible ambassador.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Kissinger's very unkind article that he wrote after Kennan's passing was right in that one sense that Kennan, was a great conceptualist, but never understood power. But you need a Kennan. You also need, Nitze, who can translate this long conceptual view into the moment of the now and what that means for U.S. industry or military, or even though I disagree with Nitze in his recommendations in many ways or his approach. But what I'm saying is you need a combination of individuals, and I think the U.S. system can produce those people very well. I think we're a meritocracy at heart, although we've gotten away from that with some of the woke junk. I think when we're more alive to the challenge, I think our country does awaken to what's needed in getting our own affairs in order economically, industrially, et cetera, but also conceptually. I think it's the interesting thing is that the Chinese are developing a culture of grand strategy. They study history. They're looking more and more at, if you look at the books that are being translated into Mandarin and have a pretty wide readership, a lot of them are the types of books that people in the United States or, say, Britain in the era of Mackinder, the kinds of questions that they would have interested themselves in. So we don't have a corner market on it, But I think we'll tend to be better at it.
So let me open up the floor to everyone else. We've had our fun. And invite anyone in the room. I see that Trevor here has a microphone if that's necessary, but if there are questions, then we can sort of take them there. Let's start right here with Garrett.
Okay, thank you so much for being, I'm wondering how the lack of experience like you had in government is affecting like our administration today with a lot of new faces in the State Department and in our foreign defense policy areas. And what do you think that effect will have on US grand strategy and foreign policy?
I think it's a good team. I think Rubio is probably the best Secretary of State that we've had in a very long time. He understands Washington. He understands the president's policies. And I think the reform with the State Department is moving in the right direction because it's bringing it back to the core traits of an effective diplomatic bureaucracy that I mentioned a minute ago. I think I think the team is good. My former colleague, Bridge Colby, who's at Pentagon now, is probably the most accomplished strategist of his generation and fundamentally gets it on the conceptual level, wrote a book on what the strategy should be, and understands high policy, I think, intimately. So I think the team, I think, is a good team, and I could go on through other members of the cabinet. I mean, any administration is going to have its software challenges and, getting people in the right place at the right time. I think on the trade side, it's similarly excellent. So I can't critique it from that standpoint. Maybe I'm biased because I'm conservative and I like a lot of what the administration is doing, but I think they needed a group of people who were willing to take risks in policy and who were willing to change the established way of doing things. And along the way, everything's not going to be a perfect execution. I think that's clear, but I would far rather have the US right now taking a disruptive path, changing the way that we've done things, than just a quiet acceptance of the old status quo that I think eventually was really going to do us harm.
I saw a hand right at the back there, and then we'll go to the other side of it.
For joining us. You hear me? Yeah.
We can.
Like it. You mentioned the shakeup of working toward reciprocity in trade, and that kind of being the goal of the administration, or at least a key component of it. I'm interested. You mentioned you'd like to see this continue in the future. What's the line that a future administration could come in to kind of identify where you would draw the line on this tariff policy? I'm interested. Do you agree fully with tariffs that are put out in this capacity, or are they working toward the goal of then being able to eliminate those trade barriers? And what would a continuity look like that you would be satisfied with?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's a very good question. I'll just give you my personal opinion. I think the tariffs are primarily an accumulation of leverage for negotiations to alter trade policy. And this is how I have viewed the tariffs from the beginning. I think there's a healthy debate inside the administration from what I'm reading. So Bessent might answer that question in a different way than Steve Moran. And I think the ultimate goal of the administration, as I understand it, not the proximate goal or the tactical goal, but the ultimate goal, as I understand it, is to address the trade balances in a way that favors the goal of reindustrialization. Maybe not reindustrialization on the scale of the 1950s, but targeted reindustrialization that would allow us to wage long-term geopolitical competition with the Chinese, to not be upside down in the event of hostilities, which we would be. I mean, at this point, the Chinese have the biggest military buildup in human history. We're way, 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 way behind. The Chinese have built more ships in the last 2 years than we built in all the periods since World War II. So I think they have the goal right. If we can't make stuff, then the game is over. So I look at the tariffs as this is how I've understood them. It's primarily about leverage for renegotiating trade deals with both allies and with rivals, and also this middle category of countries like India that are, kind of in a gray area, or let's just call them neutrals, even if they're not literally neutral. So that's how I've seen the tariffs. you know, over time, I think where this goes for this administration, for future administrations, as more and more of these agreements are inked, and I mean, we have to admit, in the last 10 months, it's an impressive array of agreements that have been struck, many of them verbal, some of them written. But I think the point of this should be kind of like with Nixon with the Smithsonian agreement, but on a bigger scale, that we're renegotiating the terms of how the US relates our market to the markets of the outside world in a way that favors reindustrialization. The long-term challenge to my mind, and this is not my subject of expertise, but it's one I think a lot about, is how do you square the circle of rebalancing trade in a way that supports reindustrialization, which I think we all agree is needed, but keeping the status of the dollar long-term, retaining its privileged status, which is tied to the trade imbalances. So that's a higher math of all this that I'm sure smarter people than I have thought through, but I think that's going to be the long-term economic challenge for the United States and internationally.
Yeah, let's continue on this.
You mentioned that one of the shortcomings of the US is that the long-term growth strategy is outdeveloped versus like legislative conditions. I feel like that's a good product of short election cycles and which are about government. Whereas all this kind of worry about that and it's much about the tender connect to. How do you think the dividends to straight with all this? Think that's the biggest one.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think ultimately it's forced upon us by external events. And so I would say the last 30 years or so, the period since the Cold War, there's been a lot of drift because we were operating in an environment that did not require us to be rigorous on a lot of these things. So there was a lot of drift in our policy. We, you know, could talk ad nauseum about the transformationalist, approach to American foreign policy. I think, though, the U.S. has, to be clear, I think we've shown a remarkable ability in the history of our republic to follow a pretty coherent grand strategy over time. The policies have altered, the particulars have altered, but it's about not allowing a hegemon to dominate either end of Eurasia, right? So the rim lines, Europe and East Asia, and I think we've been pretty consistent in that. Those being the most important regions, I think with time also the Middle East. This period of the last 30 years, we didn't really need to worry about a hegemon in either of those places. And so I think we strayed in part because the conditions that would have prompted our normal grand strategy, we just didn't need to worry about it that much, given our military prowess. And so then when I look ahead, I would say that's still the aim for the US long term. It's about maintaining balances of power in critical regions. I think external events have a way of nudging or even forcing states to focus on the behavior that's essential for their survival. And that's as true now as it was in the era of Thucydides. So I think we're living through a moment where the US is refocusing. It's playing out in our domestic politics. It's playing out in our economics. It's playing out in our foreign policy. But if you gain altitude on it, I think it's a big adjustment of the ledger. We're adjusting a lot of things simultaneously. And it's a lot to take in, but it's necessary and overdue. But I'm optimistic that we will get on a track, sort of like the early Cold War, when we woke up to the fact that we were in a protracted competition with the Soviets. It's not a dash. It really is a marathon. I think we're at a similar moment, and we're further along on that path now than we were 10 years ago. The bipartisanship in foreign policy isn't there right now because the old consensus broke down and it needed to break down. But eventually a new consensus will form, and I think it will start by forming around the subject of China I think it already is forming around that, even though the policies shift. And you can see that by the fact that, look at the Biden presidency, as much as Biden criticized Trump on the campaign trail, when he actually governed, the world situation, the crises, the constraints that he was under, pulled him back to most of the Trump foreign policy. First and foremost on China, export controls, eventually on Nord Stream. I mean, you can just go down the line and the number of areas where he ended up with a Trump-esque approach to foreign policy that he didn't want, but it's because the external environment, it imposes constraints. And so it's a long way of saying, I think we are moving towards a national consensus, similar to what happened in the early Cold War.
Wait, we've got time for one last question. I saw it up here at the front.
Thank you, Tom, first of all. And my question is, you talked about leaders like Bismarck and Metternich as sort of models for today. Who among current national leaders, and senior policy leaders abroad, would you say we can take from the West? And why?
That's a great question. I guess the first thing I would say is, just to be clear, when I was asked the wonderful question, you know, who do I wish we had today, kind of his brain, I think of a Bismarck or Metternich. But to be clear, I don't think that they're possible today. I mean, I don't think like a Bismarck who was chancellor and was like a one-man show, was, you know, brooding at his estate out in Prussia, and, you know, also running government. And I don't think that's possible in the American system because of the nature of our government. I think
Probably for the best, to be fair.
yeah, I mean, like, or even like a Metternich, where you're concentrating, you know, he's conceptualizing and implementing the foreign policy, but without any, there's no legislative check, or there's no, you know, he answers only to the Emperor Francis, or I don't think literally those people would be a person like that would be possible. But when I look abroad, it's a good question. I'd have to think about that one, because every example that's coming to my mind, I have bad things to say about. I think the jury is really out on Xi Jinping. I think there's a tendency to want to impute to him this sage-like quality, that he's taking the long view, that he has the ability in his system without legislative checks to maybe be like a Bismarck, and maybe he's. And I'm not a sinologist, but I see a lot of unforced errors on Xi Jinping's part. If anything, you may see, precisely because of the nature of a despotic system, that you may see the downsides of concentrating so much power in one person. Because when he makes a mistake, his system probably isn't quick to challenge him on it. And look at dual circulation, for example. I'm not an economist, but serious economists that I talk to, it's hard to see the logic of why Xi made this big inward turn on capital and technology when he did. It's probably a mistake strategically, but it's obscured by China's overall aggregate growth. But I guess where I'm going with it is, I think Xi Jinping is probably not the Bismarck that people sometimes assume he is, and more of the mistakes that he's making may rebound to our benefit in coming years. I don't know what's going on with the purge in the military, including a lot of people that he put there, but that is a congenital feature of an autocratic system, and it has its own self-imposing flaws, and so unfortunately none come to mind.
Well, on that sobering note, please join me in thanking our guests. And we'll look forward to seeing you all at future AGS events.